Hello and welcome to the second installment in my Dungeons and Dragons game diary series. In this series, I'll be summarizing the events of my D&D campaign, talking about any lessons I've learned about DMing from that session, discuss any homebrew that we've come up with during that session, or how previous homebrew has changed or how it was used, and just give my thoughts on DMing and D&D in general. I'm not going to give a big introduction to all of the different homebrew and the way the setting works because that's what the first video was for. So we're just going to pick up where the session started. After being severely beaten, Rhinos the monk and Taliesin the halfling warlock decided to take a short rest, which in this setting is a week, so progression and healing feels a bit more realistic. During their week of downtime, Taliesin tries to find a healer's kit, but does not because they are quite rare in this setting, as it is a very specialized set of tools. There's an entire surgeon's guild that exists in the setting, and medicine is a very coveted and highly secretive profession. Without being able to find one, she instead looks to purchase equipment that she could use to have her mule pull the cart they got in the previous session, and Rhinos tries starting a fight club, basically trying to teach some of the locals martial arts in exchange for money. She spends quite a bit of money and he doesn't make a whole lot of money, so no real serious profits were gained. Recovered slightly and still looking for money, the party asks around and picks up on three different rumors going around town, each of them setting them in three separate directions. To the north, there is reports of orcs and goblins attacking, which is in line with the previous adventure, but Taliesin was weary because of how badly Rhinos was injured in the last encounter with a single orc and a few goblins, so fighting a lot more is probably something they're gonna not want to do immediately. To the east, there is rumors of two separate parties fighting over an abandoned fort. The rumors suggest that it is two bandit groups fighting over it, and they do decide that they're going to check it out eventually, but it is actually the third rumor they decide to go investigate first because it is more time sensitive. And that is a child has gone missing in a town to the south. Just up and vanished, no one knows what happened, and they decide that's when we're going to have to investigate quickly because the kid's missing, you want to get them found fast. In real life, they say after the 12-hour mark, the chances of finding a missing person decrease drastically. So this is a very time-sensitive mission, which they almost immediately get to. Before heading out, they stop at a tavern where there is a new player character who will join them. It's very streamlined. I just said, hey, you're in the tavern, you see this guy. I didn't wait for them to get to the next village to introduce him because if I rolled him like random encounters chart and something happened, then he'd just be sitting there waiting for that to be resolved, which something did happen, but we'll get to that when we get to that. When they go over to talk to him, they see he has a sign which he is writing on, and he never vocalizes anything to them or responds to them. He just simply writes on his sign, and that is because this character is mute. This character is Camille, the Forge Cleric. Not much is known about this character's backstory as of yet. All the party knows is that he is from the country of Skojar, which is the setting's equivalent of Sweden. For context, the adventure takes place in the country of Emerald, which is the setting's equivalent of England. I think it's very easy to just take countries from real life and then just kind of approximate their behaviors and put them into a fantasy setting. You just have to make sure that it's not a one-to-one exactly because you're just going to end up misrepresenting an actual country and actual people. And that's just kind of lazy if you want to get into the ethics of it, whatever, but I just think it's bad storytelling. So these are more so streamlined, hodgepodged amalgamations of multiple countries into this one fantasy country. The mechanical reason for why he is mute is because of the way language works in the setting, where instead of regular D&D where you get a bunch of languages and you could also learn like Orcish, Dwarvish, gnomish, elvish, sylvan, all these things. Because magic is very rare in this setting, and the fantasy races aren't really races, more so alien creatures out there. There is no common language, there is just the language of the nation, and then a separate language is needed to know how to write in that language. For example, Talison's character had two languages, and he decided that instead of being able to speak and write the same language, that his character was going to be an immigrant from the country of Greyland, which is like not Ireland. So instead of being able to write in either, he could speak both. Once they meet Camille, the party decides to go south to save the kid. This is around the time the player who plays Camille, Jan, just shouts out Down syndrome ogres because, as established, ogres in the setting are just basically ogrins from Warhammer, where they're like a mutant human that are stupider and stronger. And I guess he was looking for like the actual like condition for that. And saying it back, it doesn't really capture how funny it was because of how out of the blue it was, but it was very, very funny. And it probably would have been a -1 honor situation if it wasn't just that funny. They continue traveling south down the road, where they run to a small village. As they pull up, Talison's character goes into a whole spiel about parking the cart, trying to read a sign, not being able to read because the character can't read, talking to the party to try to read the sign, asking people around the town what town it is, and then trying to ask more information about the kid who went missing. Basically, this whole big thing that took like 15 to 20 minutes, and ultimately it was the wrong town. It was a whole song and dance just to not actually be in the right town. I think this little thing could have been resolved if they simply asked more details about the rumor they were investigating before leaving, such as finding the town name, finding out what towns in the area, things like that, and also just not role playing every little thing. Like saying you're finding a stable is fine, but to like go and describe how you're setting up your horse and unbuckling everything, it's just kind of excessive. Especially when it's not really interacting with another player, it's just talking. So that's going to be something I'm going to have to look out for more in the future. Once they pass through that town to the actual town they were going to, just before they enter on the road, there is a random encounter where they encounter a kid trying to capture chickens and put them into a basket because they got out. This again involves a lengthy getting off the cart section, which leads into a very overcomplicated thing about getting the chickens and putting them in the cart, and then just get out of the cart and use a dex check to put the chickens in the basket. It wasn't that complicated of a encounter, and that's ultimately what they did. And because they helped the kid put the chickens into the basket, the kid gave them one chicken. They named the chicken Bono after a gelatinous cube they found in the not previous campaign, but 2 campaigns ago was a urban fantasy style game where they found these little gelatinous cubes, and one was kept as a pet, and it was called Bono. In the town, they ask around for more details. The adults point to the kids and say, well, they're the last ones to see her. Looking around town, talking to the kids, they find the rough area of where the girl went missing, and their story is that she was just running, and then she screamed and disappeared, like in an instant, and they were so scared they just ran away and told people, and people looked for a bit and couldn't find her, so they just kind of spread the rumor around that she went missing, and then it got to the party. She was probably only missing for about a day by the time the party showed up. Maybe not even a full day. The party gets back on their wagon and goes towards the wheat fields where the girl went missing. And their first checks to look around that Rhinos and Taliesin make are very low. They don't find any trails, whereas Camille makes a very, very good survival check to see footprints, which he follows, and then in the middle of a field, there is a almost like a sinkhole, like a crevice is opened up in the dirt, and down there is the girl basically pinched 127 hours style. They could barely hear her, but she's asking for help, and that she thinks that there's something down there. The party comes up with a convoluted way of getting her before ultimately deciding on tying the rope to the halfling Taliesin and lowering her down to grab the girl and then pull her up. Camille jokingly makes a constitution roll to see if he sneezes while holding the rope, and he gets like a 2, so he fails, and that's funny, so it's stuck. And then Rhino says, well, I'll make the check then, and then he gets a really low number. So they basically just drop the halfling down the hole. And the last thing they hear is her screaming and then a thud. And they estimate that she fell about 30 feet. It was enough to down her, and she was going to have to begin making death saves. But luckily, Camille is a Forge Cleric, and he had Healing Word prepared, and as he began to cast, Jan realized that he made a grave mistake. Healing Word has a verbal component, as do most spells, if not all of the spells in D&D. You need to be able to speak to cast them. This led to like 20 minutes of laughing because he basically made a character that was mostly useless in order to kind of salvage this, and again, it's funny, and to kind of be more thematic with it instead of just having the character do nothing or just whatever, make a new character. We took however much gold he had and removed a bunch of it. So he basically lost a good portion of his gold, and instead he has to use custom-made tuning forks to cast his spells. It's probably something I'm not going to allow other characters to do, and we're only doing it because I don't want to have to introduce a new character right now without any real explanation. Because obviously this character wouldn't just now realize that he can't do magic when he's a trained cleric. He casts Healing Word, which again can reach the halfling. The halfling is healed. They raise her up with the rope, and they almost have a innocent casualty situation where their plan is to tie the rope around the girl's shoulders and then pull it up, which probably would have slipped and ended up just strangling the girl, or at worst snapping her neck or suffocating her or something like that, basically just throttling her. Luckily, they just decide to grab her and pull the halfling up, and they do manage to save her without killing her, which is a miracle in its own right. They escort the girl back to the village, where her parents are glad to see her, and they give the party several loaves of bread as a thank you. Yet again, the party has not made any money, but they did something very good in that they managed to return a child alive to her parents. But now they have information that the crevice actually leads somewhere, because when the halfling fell in, she went into a big stone chamber, which I'm realizing I did not mention at the time, but oh well. The party returns to the crevice and begins descending with rope. They all manage to slide down, except for Camille, who falls, and he is not downed, but he is severely injured. He casts Healing Word on himself, and I believe this is where he crit heals. He rolls very, very well and gets a crit on his spellcasting roll, because again, in this game we're using rolling instead of spell slots, and there's a variety of different things that could happen when you either crit fail or crit succeed. In this situation, he just cast it at a higher level, which would be second level, which being able to cast a second level spell at first level is really good, even if it's just a upcasted first level spell. Looking around the room, they see multiple shelves with tons and tons of documentation and paperwork, and there is rubble on the floor with some dirt, obviously where the cave-in happened. This is very obviously not the main entrance, and I will be putting a rough diagram of how the map looks. It's not the map taken from Roll20, which is what we actually used. This is just me recreating it to cut out all the little bits of unnecessary detail. As you can see in the diagram, there are two passageways to the left and to the right. They decide to take the right passage and enter a room with a large statue of a young woman holding goblets of some kind, or cups and bottles. There are multiple empty bottles of wine all around the floor, and at the base of the statue there is a basin, obviously for offerings of some kind. And Camille, being a cleric, decides to make a religion check. He rolls exceptionally well, which means he gets a bit of a lore dump, which I will now share with you. This is a statue of the goddess Katrina, who is the goddess of alcohol and fermentation and partying, that whole kind of sphere of influence, and she is considered a fiend or basically a demon in most theology, although because she is a more so chaotic neutral going into chaotic evil than just an explicitly evil deity, there's still some wiggle room where she's accepted and worshipped, but it's primarily seen as like a negative thing. And as you see by the spelling, which I'm going to be putting on the screen right now, her name is spelled Ctarina, and that is because in language, CT right next to each other, right, especially with CTH, means relating to death. It is a suffix or prefix depending on how you use it. It's where the term nectar comes from, because nectar is a word that means beverage, which the gods in ancient Greece and Roman theology would drink to stay immortal. The CT part of it is referring to death, and then the rest of it is the avoidance of it. And that ties into her character because she is a goddess of fermentation, which is related to necromancy in the sense that it is taking something that is alive and allowing it to die in a very specific way to transform it into something else. He also learned a little bit about the other necromancy god, and that is the lawful evil god of necromancy, Cathanatoth, which is a mix of Thanatos, which is the god of death from Greek mythology, Thoth, which is the god of knowledge from Egyptian mythology, and then that CTH, which again refers to death. It's why Cthulhu is called Cthulhu, because CT and CTH refers to death. And his original domain was of meat preservation, which again is how it becomes a necromancy god, because it is taking this thing that is alive and then allowing it to die and change and then preserving it in this new form. That's how all of the fiends, or rather the demonic gods, the evil gods in this setting work, is that they're all kind of perversions and bastardizations of other positive things, which is a result of the theology of that this was a good god that fell in some way, basically like a fallen angel situation. The only difference is that they had a role within their celestial society, which is fitting because all of the gods that are worshipped in this setting, at least from the human perspective, are gods of labor. Camille, Jan's character, who is the Forge cleric, is a follower of the god of the Forge, Sonir, whose name doesn't really have any kind of deeper meaning. I just went on Fantasy Name Generator and it sounded good, and it sounds dwarvish and Scandinavian and like a smith. So I'm gonna be honest, not everything I do is as interesting or esoteric as the naming of the necromancy gods. Just know that a lot of things I do have some kind of deeper meaning. Not always, but a lot of them. He also learns a little bit more about different gods relating to death, all of the CTH gods, but I'm not going to go dumping all that lore here because it's not really relevant. Taliesin attempts to cast False Life, but fails the check, and because of the proximity to the necromancy god of wine, as this is one of her shrines, the failure results in all of the liquid that she is carrying being converted into a very, very alcoholic beverage, more so like vinegar than an actual wine. It's basically undrinkable. And I think that was a bit too harsh because the roll wasn't that bad. I probably shouldn't have done that, but it did and it happened, and it's not going to be too much of a setback because you just get more water in the village, and we'll just avoid doing that for minor failures going forward. They continue going from left, now down towards the entrance, which they see the room has carvings of various people partying, and the main doorway that leads up is clearly filled in with dirt. This was obviously like the basement of a building or some kind of tomb that was buried over, and it just filled with dirt. So that explains why, Despite there being a farm on top, no one knew that there was this thing underneath the ground until there was a cave-in. It's at this point I will mention that this dungeon does have two zombies in it, and they just haven't noticed because the zombies are moving quite slowly and they're moving at a pretty quick pace, dashing around the dungeon. So this entire time, one zombie has been slowly staggering behind them. They just didn't notice because they weren't actively making investigation checks to find it. They actually encounter their first zombie when they go back around to the storage room where they see a zombie in the corner just sitting there. It slowly rises, combat kicks off. It tries to hit Rhinos, it fails. It's mainly going to be attacking him because he's the one who got there first, so it's its main target. Camille runs in and begins preparing to cast a healing spell on it, hoping that'll help, or at least destroy it with positive energy. It does not. I get what he's going for, and maybe if there was like a critical success or some other positive energy spell, then it would work, but it doesn't. Around this time, they also notice that the zombie is dressed in what was once very fancy, flamboyant clothing, has just been turned brown and gray from all the dirt and lost its luster. Very clearly a reveler or a partier or a bard even. Obviously someone who would hold the goddess Katrina in very high regards. They keep hitting it with their hammers and their swords and their sticks, and they're fighting it, and none of the damage they're doing is really doing anything to it. It's basically immune to conventional weaponry. The way I have zombies work is that they're very much like the Return of the Living Dead zombies, where they cannot be killed. You could chop them up, you could crush them, you could dismember them, and they're still going to be undead or alive. They're still going to be moving around. Mechanically, what happens is that you can make attacks against them, and whenever you do, it has to make a constitution save versus the amount of damage taken. And if it fails, then it's damaged in some way, but its hit points is not reduced. So let's say Rhino slashes at it with a short sword and it fails the con save, then I'll have a little table where I could roll hit locations, and if it cuts off the arm, then it'll have a disadvantage on grapple checks, or it'll have a -3 to hit or something, or a minus whatever to hit. If he hits the legs and maybe it's knocked prone and it only has a crawl speed, it can't stand up properly. Or you stab its eyes and it can't see as well. That kind of thing. Where you could keep breaking it down, you could dismember it, but you're just making more individual monsters to fight. You're not actually destroying it. Rhinos, using the torch he lit when he first entered the dungeon, tries to set on fire. The bludgeoning damage doesn't do anything, but the fire does do damage. These things can be killed with fire damage. Same thing goes for radiant damage. The only difference is that radiant damage is a lot more effective at destroying them, whereas fire is less effective, but it still can do it. The only way of killing undead, or rather specifically these undead as in zombies, is to burn them, fry them with radiant damage, trap them somewhere so they're basically stuck, or use some kind of banishment magic or religion checks to give it its final rites, and then it'll just stop being alive. But again, that's only for certain undead or certain zombies. These undead arose from not being given proper burial rites, and they just occurred naturally. There wasn't a necromancer who cast a spell on them. Maybe the proximity to a shrine of Katrina did contribute to them coming back, but it wasn't like someone cast a spell on them and that would need to be dispelled. You can't give them a rites that way. You can't get rid of those kind of zombies by just giving them their final rites. But they keep trying to chop it up, and eventually Camille casts Searing Smite because he is a Forge Cleric. He gets that. He tries casting it once and fails, and then he succeeds another time. He asks if failing is what cuts him off, but it doesn't. It's basically getting 2 critical failures in a row or something like that. Basically 2 big failures in a row would end your run of spellcasting for the day, but that doesn't happen. And, of course, the Searing Smite does damage it significantly because it's adding fire damage. So it does a lot more damage to it. At this point, Taliesin begins attempting to light her torch, but she fails the survival check to get it lit in time, and instead the afterburn of the searing smite and also Rhinos continually burning it with its torch cause it to finally die and catch flame and kind of shrivel up like a fly that was hit by a bug zapper. And it's dead. And as they finish it, stumbling out of the darkness into the torchlight is the second zombie that has been slowly following them around. The first zombie encounter was very drawn out because they didn't really know how to fight it, and there wasn't really any interesting environmental things to worry about. There was no other monsters to kind of put them in a corner other than the zombie that was slowly staggering towards them. So since there's only one zombie left in the room, I just let them, out of combat, make strength checks to kind of grab it and pin it down and tie it up. And then Camille was able to make religion checks to give this zombie its last rites, which lets its spirit pass on, and then which basically kills a zombie. With these two zombies, then Taliesin does a loop around a few more times to look around to make sure everything is dead and gone. There was some confusion with Usopp, Rhinos' player, where he thought that the caved-in stairway was leading down as opposed to up. That was clarified. And with that, they looked around the storage room for loot, where they find multiple barrels of dried grapes. Can't really eat them. They're not really raisins. They're basically just desiccated grapes on bushels. Essentially, it is just grape seeds for the use of starting another vineyard. And there is enough grape seeds in this storage room to create a successful vineyard, along with 12 bottles of wine, which they can't date currently, but they seem to be quite valuable, and they split them evenly amongst the three of them. Taliesin goes looking up and retrieves some documents, and because Rhinos has calligraphy tools, he actually can read, which I should have mentioned earlier when Camille held up a sign. There's basically no way for Taliesin to understand what Camille is saying without Rhinos there, which is gonna come up eventually, and it's gonna be really funny to see how they work that out. But they read through their documents and discover that this was at one point a very profitable vineyard above this tomb slash shrine that eventually shut down and was replaced with a much less profitable wheat farm. Using these sales documents, they're able to determine that the wine they have is very, very expensive and could be sold for a lot of money. The issue being they need to find a collector or someone who has a lot of money to spend on this stuff, because they can't just go to the village and try selling it at the tavern, because the tavern doesn't have enough money to cover the cost of the wine. If the wine costs $500 a bottle, the entire village may have like 50 gold between all of them, so they're gonna have to go travel somewhere to sell this. That is added to their list of things to do, but the more immediate thing they want to do is find out how to get all of these grape seeds out of the storage room, because they want to take it and then possibly start a vineyard or sell them off or do something with them. And this is where it gets very OSR very quickly. If you don't know, the way old leveling was done is that it was gold per XP. Basically, the treasure you got in a dungeon contributed to how much experience you had, which meant how much XP you could gain was based on your carry weight, which is where things like Tensor's floating disc comes from. And the way you would get treasure is you'd have to pay people to carry it out, or you have to make multiple trips, or you'd have to hire a mule or set up a pulley system, or again use magic like Tensor's floating disc. And extracting the treasure and loot from the dungeon was as much as a part of the game as fighting or discovering the tomb in the first place. There's a long discussion about how they could possibly dig this up, possibly hiring day laborers to come and dig it up, whether or not they should inform the villagers that this shrine is under here, whether or not they're going to have to pay money to the owner of the farmlands or the guy who runs it or the lord or whoever because they're extracting wealth from it. It's a whole discussion about how they're going to get this treasure out of the dungeon, and I really, really, really like that. I want more of that in the future. Hopefully it's things that are a bit more involved, like the one thing I always go to is like getting a chandelier out of a dungeon, because it's such a pain in the ass, but to think of how you'd get it out all in one piece and then salvage it and then sell it for gold to get the XP, all the strategy that had to go into it, it becomes very, very interesting how the party has to think about all the weird ways they have to physically move objects within the world. It makes it feel more physical and gives actual like visualization to what you're doing in the game, because there's this actual object that needs to be moved. And this is around the time the game starts to slowly sputter out, and we decide to call it there, with the party agreeing to come up with some plans of how to get this stuff out of here, which will be going into next session, which that's basically the summary done. So we're going to go into some stuff about future sessions. Obviously, the most immediate thing is getting this treasure out of the dungeon. It's going to be fun to see how they come up with a way of getting it out. It's probably going to be a lot more complex than it actually needs to be, but that's part of the fun. And the second thing is those other two rumors, the rumors of orcs and then the rumors of a abandoned fort being fought over by two rivaling groups of bandits. Depending on how much of a rest they take and how long this takes, those things could go a variety of different ways without them being involved. Maybe they go and check out that abandoned fort and it's only one bandit group, and then they could fight that bandit group and take over the fort for themselves. And then later down the line, they're gonna have to meet with a lord and get an official titleship or owner of it. It's a whole snowball of things that could happen. Or maybe up north where there are reports of orcs, maybe they go to that village and it's just not there anymore because the orcs raided it. Maybe refugees flee to the south or to that abandoned fort. It could be any number of things that happen because the party wasn't there to solve the problem. And it's not like it's a bad thing that happened, because if they did go fight the orcs or did go check out the abandoned fort, then the girl who's stuck in the crevice probably would have died of starvation or dehydration or exhaustion from being down there. Or she would have fallen into the pit further, probably died from the fall, if not seriously injured, and was attacked by zombies. So they didn't make a morally wrong choice by choosing one of the options. It's just that no matter what you do, there's always a good chance that something bad is going to happen because you just can't be everywhere at once. One of the themes of the original iteration of this setting, which I always imply stuff about the original iteration and the original quote-unquote West March. It wasn't really a West March, but they called it a West March server where I ran in the setting. One of the core themes was of the party shows up and does a bunch of magic and crazy stuff and fights some things, and then they just leave. And then if they come back, they'd see that everything's destroyed, because the world doesn't work by good people showing up and then fixing a thing and then leaving. It takes a constant stream of effort to make something better. You can't show up to a village, use magic to create a bunch of food, and then leave. You didn't fix the underlying issue of the soil's bad and there's not producing enough crops to grow food. Or you kill all the goblins in the sewers, but you never figure out where the goblins are coming from, so more goblins just show up later, and you're just not there for the next time they attack somebody. And that's kind of related to the idea of that they can't be everywhere. The difference being that the people in that group were kind of like terrible and just not good people in general, let alone good characters. Whereas my players in this game are actually trying to be good, and their failures in that are of no fault of their own. It's just the nature of trying to be good. You can't save everyone because you can't be everywhere all at once. But getting back on track to future adventures, they are gonna have to find some kind of appraiser or a collector or some kind of wealthy person to buy those wines, because the common man is not gonna be able to give them enough money to make it worth it. Like, sure, you could sell it for 100 gold from someone who's moderately wealthy, but that's like maybe 10% of value you could get out of it. It's like finding a violin at a thrift store for $15 and you resell it on eBay for $200. You could probably sell it for much more if you went to someone who's professional, and you're still making money, it's just not nearly as much as you'd want to. And I haven't exactly decided on the exact value of the wine. I just know it's going to be very pricey. The thing is that it's going to be in their back pocket for a very long time. So by the time they actually do sell it, the high cost of the wine will be recuperated in how much money they spent getting to the place to sell it. And with that said, that is basically everything I wanted to say about this session. I still haven't thought of a good way of signing off, so thanks for watching and listening. I apologize for the poor quality. It's not going to get any better.